It's great to be back with you. This first day of fall, I know you can feel it outside. And we're always glad to be here. Rochelle is with me today, and she asked us, like, they don't really care if I'm there. And I was like, they really do. Because every time I'm here, all people ask about me is where you are. And I try not to take that personally. It's like, I'm actually here. And so Rochelle's with me. Our girls are in Austin having a sisters weekend. And David did ask me to present the same content that I did at Pepperdine back in May. And when I mentioned that to Rochelle this morning, she says, does he know that those sermons are a lot longer? And I said, I don't know that he does yet, but I know David's doing one of the keynotes this upcoming year at Pepperdine. So if that's news to you, go ahead and book your flight and your hotel to be there for that. That would be the only reason that I would go. Like, that's enough reason to go. So here you get a little bit of Hebrews that we're going to dive into this morning. And before we do that, let me ask God's blessing on our time. God, we're grateful that you love us and that you have adopted us as your daughters and your sons. And that we arrive here this morning, Lord, with whatever's going on in our lives, however we're feeling, whatever we're going through, like knowing and trusting that you are doing more than we could ask or imagine. And so regardless of what that is, we would ask that you draw us near to you. And toward that end, God, I pray that you pour through me the gift of preaching. That everything said here be from you and because of you and guiding us toward you, Lord. As we partner with you to bring about your preferred future for all of creation. And we ask it in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, it's so good to be here because for years I have come to this room for worship. Starting maybe even over 20 years ago when I was a youth minister here in town, I remember speaking here at Summer Youth Series and at Soul Links. And I am, like many of you, like a child of the church. Like I grew up in Churches of Christ in Mississippi. And one of the best memories I have of my early days in the church is where we lived in southern Mississippi. Every fifth Sunday, or four fifth Sundays a year, we would have a fifth Sunday singing. And here's what would happen. The fifth Sunday singing is exactly what it sounds like. So every fifth Sunday, one of the local churches in and around our area would invite all of the people from the other churches, and we would get together and we would just sing. Folks would just call out numbers, they'd write them on the board, and we just go through all of the songs, and it was great. And I remember going to all of those churches when I was a little kid, and it was soon after I did that long enough that it dawned on me, like all of these places, all of these church buildings are exactly the same. Like, you know, I didn't know if it was just in Mississippi or wherever, but every Church of Christ that I was in as a kid was exactly the same. You'd walk in, and there was a little lobby area and this A-frame auditorium, not sanctuary. And along the sides of the auditorium, not sanctuary, were like these classrooms where you would have Bible class and Sunday school, and they were exactly the same. I think I grew up thinking that if your building didn't look like those buildings, then you weren't actually a church. And it wasn't until later that I went to college and then I was in graduate school and I started taking church history classes that I saw that different places of worship looked differently to convey different aspects of who God was. Like one of the most beautiful places in the world to worship is St. Peter's Basilica. And here's a picture of it. My father-in-law went there years ago, and he came back and he was talking about how wondrous it is and how big it is. And the bigness is intentional. When you're there, the bigness is designed to help you feel appropriately small in the presence of God. And my wife grew up in Arizona. And here's a picture of the Chapel of the Holy Cross in Sedona. And there's this beautiful cross carved into this church, built into the red rocks, where you can see all of creation. And back this spring, I officiated a wedding in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, at this place at Thorn Crown Chapel. And it's built right in the middle of the woods in the Ozarks. And the couple getting married, they're both photographers. And she's a model, which means that he's a really good photographer. And they wanted this beautiful setting to exchange their vows and to exchange rings. And the chapel's made of glass. And as you're there, you hear this rolling water. And I was talking to one of the musicians who performs at both the weddings and serves the church there on Sunday. He originally served a church there in Dallas. He says, I love this because people come every weekend, and I have a new congregation every weekend. Do you know what a new congregation every weekend means? No elders meetings. And then some weeks there are 10 people, and some weeks there are 200 or 300. And they'll have bikers, Christian bikers show up one day, and at the second service, it'll be a bunch of old ladies who are just coming around Arkansas. I love sacred spaces. And for me, the church has always been a sacred space. Even the time that I was in youth group, I grew up in a church in Atlanta that had a pretty large youth group. In our summers, we would send 10, 12, 15 mission trips all around the United States and some into Mexico. And it was there that I taught Bible class for the first time in that youth group. It's where I fell in love with Jesus. And I went to ACU as an undergraduate Bible major. When I started as a freshman, there were over 100 just youth and family ministry majors. When I go back there now, there aren't even 100 Bible majors of any kind. Lots changed over the last 20 or 30 years when it comes to the church. And some of that change, in many ways, has been good. But I suspect that many of you see and sense and feel some of the same things that I see and sense and feel. But things just aren't the same. I talked to my mother yesterday. And I was asking her because for a while she's trying to decide whether she's going to stay at the church where she has been for a long time or whether she needs to find something closer as she gets older. And we were talking about what she likes about one congregation versus what she likes about another congregation. And she doesn't like everything about any of them, but that's her right. You get to do that when you're in your mid-70s. And she goes, Sean, I think I just have to admit something to myself. She says, I'm just old school Church of Christ. And I said, we all already knew that. Probably in the last 5 to 7 years. Church in the American church scene has changed more than it has in my 26 years of being in ministry and my 30 plus years of working in churches. And I think about our own church, my church here in town, or before COVID and things were kind of blowing and going. It's a 3-campus church, so we had 50 people who are on our staff. And now when I look around at our all-staff meetings, there are fewer than 30 of us. We're coming back out of COVID like every other church. and we didn't really know what to do. No one had ever lived and worked and pastored a church through a pandemic before, so we didn't know what to do or when things would bounce back. And for us and for everybody that I know, things just took a whole lot longer than we hoped they would, than we thought they would, and in some ways, they never did. And I look around at my church, where one of my jobs every week is to chart attendance. And I see it go from here to here to here to here to here to here to here. And I stand in front of them, and I see a lot of empty seats. And there was a time at our church where there were no empty seats, where we would have to get up and tell folks, hey, we need everybody to scoot in, make room for folks who are arriving late. There are people who would sit cross-legged in the aisles or stand up against the wall, but there are plenty of seats now. And it's not like all those empty seats, it's not like we're saving those for Elijah or someone like that. There's empty seats. And when all that begins to happen for you, what's a church supposed to do? Well, I can tell you what we've done. Everyone that I talk to is just grasping for something that works. Like something, anything that will fill those seats. I mean, you guys live right here in Houston alongside with me. There's one church here in Houston has decided that the best way to fill all of those seats is just to go all in with one side of the political spectrum. So they did a series earlier this year or late last year called The Church Awake, Not Woke. And why? Because they knew that there is a market, there are people who will fill those seats to hear that message. That same church, their pastor called immigrants trash and garbage, just hoping that that message puts bottoms in those empty seats. And there's another congregation down the street from one of our campuses, and every holiday that comes around, they turn their entire church facility, it's just into like Disney World, complete with princesses and castles. And there's nothing wrong with doing any of those things to serve families and to serve people well, but the reason that they do it is because they think that it will put butts in those empty seats. And there's another church that we're familiar with that's not far from us, that where one church decides that they're going to go this way in just embracing whole hog the politics of one side of Americans' partisan divide, that they're just going to go the other for the same reason, because it'll fill those seats. And I know that in this fellowship, in Churches of Christ, the churches that raised me and nurtured me, that we do have a baseline insecurity. Church of Christ leaders just don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to grow churches. So let's just do what we see other churches around us doing, what are community churches doing. Let's sprinkle in some church growth principles over here. Let's embrace this racist homogeneous unit principle. Let's ask our preacher to wear skinny jeans and sit at a table with a pub vibe all built around it. Because when you look around, when you cruise, all the churches on YouTube seem like they're doing well. It seems like that's what they're all doing. I sat with a group of preachers in Joplin, Missouri, not too long ago, and asked them about the worship experience that we had just had at this large gathering. And it was so large that it was worthy of all of the production that they had put into it. But the people I was sitting with, their churches were much smaller, and they were trying to do the very same thing of putting on this huge production that they had just seen. And I asked them, like, explain this to me. And my friend Brian said, well, it just seems like it's working. And I know when you see empty seats, I know the anxiety that comes with that because I've done things, I've preached sermons that I knew were good for the market. Because feeling empowered feels so much better than feeling marginalized. And like, I'm an American. I've got a good-sized home. My wife drives a nice car. My daughter goes to private school. It's a good life. And one of the things that could make it a better life is that when I looked around, if everyone celebrated and rewarded my faith and the way that I see the world. And so faith then becomes a means, a lever to get what I really want, which is comfort. And when comfort taps out, maybe I can find a faith that works for me instead of a work in me. I get it, I feel it. And then I run headlong into the book of Hebrews. And the book of Hebrews is about a people who are tempted to look at Jesus and look at the world around them and trade their faith in Jesus for something that looks like it works. A faith that's got more flag salutes than it has faithful suffering. And just when I feel tempted to abandon Jesus for some cloned ChatGPT, cable news ready, bloodless version of faith, when I want to settle for a faith that is devoid of suffering, the writer of Hebrews sits me down and he says this, starting in verse 10. He says, recall those earlier days when after you had been enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to insults and afflictions, and sometimes becoming partners with those so treated. For you had compassion for those who were in prison, and you cheerfully accepted the plundering of your possessions, knowing that you yourselves possess something better and more lasting. Do not, therefore, abandon that boldness of yours. It brings a great reward. For you need endurance so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. For yet in a very little while, the one who is coming will come and will not delay, but my righteous one will live by faith. My soul takes no pleasure in anyone who shrinks back, but we are not among those who shrink back and so are lost, but among those who have a faith and so preserve our souls. So Hebrews comes and says, we are the ones who do not shrink back. And doesn't that sound good? Like, I've heard a lot of sermons in my lifetime about not shrinking back, and people like the idea of not shrinking back when not shrinking back means going on offense. Taking the fight to them when not shrinking back means harnessing up a bunch of keyboard courage or spouting half-truths on Twitter, or when not shrinking back means making demands of everyone else that they share or have or take on your convictions. When not shrinking back means that you have license to mistreat people who don't think like you. But that's not what Hebrews calls not shrinking back. Hebrews says that not shrinking back is perseverance. It's endurance. And perseverance and endurance always sound awful because perseverance and endurance are never fun. Like, no one has ever said, that was the greatest vacation of my life, but I persevered. Like, no one's ever said, this dessert was incredible, I endured it. We only need perseverance. We only need endurance when we know that we are suffering. When what looks like faith is failing. And so there's a philosopher named Robert Roberts, whose parents apparently had no creativity at all. And he talks about what perseverance is, and he says that there are three parts of perseverance. He says perseverance isn't courage. Courage is the ability to look something directly in the eye and to live inside it and to keep going. And he says that perseverance isn't patience either. Patience is the ability to bear a difficult situation over time and with grace. He says rather it's three other elements. He says perseverance first takes foresight. That's the first thing. And perseverance takes foresight is the reason why your children drive you crazy. Because kids have no foresight. They have no ability for foresight. I was at a church in Oklahoma not too long ago, and they were doing a special service where the little kids, stayed in service all the way through, just up to the sermon. And there was a little kid sitting behind me on the pew, and you would have thought that someone had just robbed their house blind the way he complained about having to sit in service. There's no foresight. It's not going to be that long. It's not going to be every Sunday. Perseverance requires foresight. Perseverance also requires a moral passion. You have to become the kind of person, we have to become the kinds of people who see the inherent good in being the kind of person who keeps their commitments. And perseverance requires a strength of will. And that means you don't live in the moment or want the thing that's right in front of you. You live for the things that you want most, not the things that you want now. And perseverance, the Hebrew writer says, gives rise to a faith that doesn't shrink back. And so often, the very thing that we think makes us people of conviction are simply the actions of people who lack perseverance and endurance. We become people who do whatever, whenever, to whomever, simply to end our own suffering. And part of the reason is because there are so many alternatives to faith that call themselves faith. Nationalism is an alternative to faith that calls itself faith. It doesn't require endurance, it just requires power and violence and force. And economics are an alternative to faith, and it doesn't require endurance either. It requires connections, an underprivileged work class. It requires the randomness of a set of skills that culture and society at that moment in time find valuable. And culture wars are an alternative to faith. And they don't require endurance either. That's just memes and hateful words and posting things online. It's become so easy to desire a life that's comfortable and to call it faith because perseverance and endurance are the only things you need. You only need them when you are suffering. And Hebrews says the key to endurance isn't what we think it is. The key to endurance is to recall the old days. Ara Norenzayan is a psychologist at the University of Columbia, and he wrote a book called Big Gods: How Religion and Transformed Cooperation and Conflict. And he talks in Big Gods about 3 experiments. And one, they were trying to see how people behaved in anonymity. So they gathered all of these students, and they gave half the students clear glasses and half the students dark shaded glasses. And they were going to teach them, they were telling them that this was about the release of a product line. But in an unrelated task, before they gave them the glasses, they were given $6 and a chance to share that $6, however much, with anyone that they wanted to. And those wearing the clear glasses they gave away on average $2.71. And those with the dark glasses gave an average of $1.81. Just that idea of wearing sunglasses and giving yourself some anonymity reduced generosity. And then in another experiment, they were testing the dictator effect, in which all of these students were given $10 and the opportunity to share none of it or as much as they wanted with an anonymous stranger. But beforehand, without them realizing it, they were shown a pair of eyes on a computer screen. While half the group saw a pair of eyes, the other half was shown a different image. And those who saw the pair of eyes gave away 55 cents more on average than those who didn't see a pair of eyes. And in the third experiment, researchers placed a coffee maker in a hallway that anyone could come and get their coffee and leave money in the cup. And for a few weeks, they left up a pair of eyes looking down over the coffee maker. And other weeks, just a portrait of flowers. And on average, the weeks that there were eyes looking down the coffee maker, people who came and got coffee left 2 times as much money. And so Noren Zion came to this conclusion. He says, watched people are nice people. But when Jonathan Sacks, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who was the head rabbi in the UK for much of his career, when he looked at the experiment and the results of the experiment, this is what he says. He says, this is part of what makes religion a force for honest and altruistic behavior. The belief that God sees what we do. Less obvious is the experimental finding that what makes the difference to the way we behave is not simply what we believe, but rather the fact of being reminded of it. So here's this little quirk about human beings. We are better people when we are reminded to be better people. And that's why in Hebrews, the Hebrew writer says, recall the days of old. He's saying you don't have to go spiritual grab bagging. You want success, and I know that, and you want packed pews and the corner office, and you want to be chairman of the board, and you want a seat in the cabinet room. But we are people of perseverance and not power trips or presidencies. And then he says, this is what it looks like. He says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Indeed, by faith, our ancestors received approval. By faith, we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was made from other things that are not visible. So our fundamental problem in life is that we actually deeply believe that seeing is believing. And when you think that seeing is believing, then faith just becomes a house that you visit and not a home that you live in. It becomes like an Airbnb faith. You look for it for all of the amenities and what you can offer it, but you're really there just to do something else. Faith, Hebrews says, is a conviction of things that you're not seeing. So when you're looking around and you're despondent about the state of the world or your own life or your church or your children or your parents, and you are despondent about what you see, you're walking in the opposite direction of faith, because faith is about what you don't see. Faith is the conviction that God is now up to something in the world and has always been up to something in the world that you cannot see. And what makes a difference is not what we believe. What makes a difference is being reminded of what we believe. So Hebrews then launches into this list of people who have endured. And the Hebrew writer comes and he says, I'm going to tell you about all of these people who have endured. And he's just asking if he can get a witness. And so he's got some, because Cain has got a witness and he's got something to say. And Noah and Abraham and Sarah and Rahab and Moses, on and on again, case after case of people who have endured. And Hebrews 11 is this long list of folks who didn't give up, who didn't give in, who are sitting in your position, and they endured. And because they endured, you can too. And I don't know what you were feeling when you walked in here today. But Hebrews is saying that there is this litany of women and men who have felt the way you feel. And through faith, they endured. That you are not alone. And you have never been alone. And so, when the writer gets to chapter 12, he says this, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely. And let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. And this is the place where I really wish that the Bible would give me more. Like, I would love for there to be a system of how to endure. Like, is there no 3-point outline? Is there no 5 steps, a plan, a strategy? We want to know. Tell us how. How did all of these people endure? What are the ingredients? There's got to be some manual for this, but it doesn't. And instead of a 3-point plan or an outline or a strategy, all Hebrews gives us is a cloud. It says, you are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. And for a long time, when I read about the great cloud of witnesses, I always felt warm and fuzzy. That's supposed to be comforting. It's like Charmin. But last spring, I was a chaperone on my youngest daughter's choir trip to Chicago. And if you ever get a chance to be a chaperone on a choir trip, don't. So we left here from Houston at 6:30. Our flight was out at 6:30, which meant that we were at the airport at 4:30 that morning. And the nice thing was that because we were the first group out, we traveled in 2 big groups, that morning our agenda called for us to go to Willis Tower in Chicago. Willis Tower is the 12th tallest building in the world. It's 112 stories. And at the 106th story, there is this glass window all around where you go and you look out, and on a clear day, you can see in every direction. You can see 4 states in every direction. And so I was excited to go. But the day we went wasn't a clear day. It was 36 degrees in Chicago, and it was rainy and foggy. And we still had it on our agenda, on our itinerary for the day, so we got to Willis Tower. The kids are excited. We split up into the groups who were going upstairs to the 106th floor. And when we got to the 106th floor, this is what we saw. And that's when I realized we couldn't see anything, but we were in the cloud. We went up 106 floors to see something, and when we got there, we were in the cloud, and when you are in the cloud, all you can see is the cloud. When Hebrews says that we are in a great cloud of witnesses, it's not trying to make us feel cozy. It's reminding us that there have been people who have been here before, and they couldn't see either. but through faith, they endured. And when the cloud is all you have, the cloud is all you need. Because when Jews heard the word cloud, they would have thought about the presence of God or meeting God. God was in the cloud in the wilderness, and God was the cloud above the mercy seat. God was the cloud that filled the temple. We are in the cloud, and when you are in the cloud, all you can see is the cloud. And this is a word that I've desperately needed over the last year. Because you all know that last summer 2023, that my older brother died. And he was only 53 and probably the healthiest that he had been in 20 years, and it was sudden, unexpected. And every day, some point in the day, I have questions about if anything that I do matters or that we do matters, because in the end, we're all just going to die anyway, and everything is pointless. And my daughters say that I'm in my Ecclesiastes era. And every day, somebody somewhere needs to be reminded to endure. And on the day that my brother died, on the morning he died, my mom's preacher, Don McLaughlin, spoke with her. The next thing we knew, he had arranged for a plane ticket, and I remember talking to him as I was sitting outside of where we were on vacation in California watching the sunrise. And my friends called, talked me through those next couple of days. And my friend John Turner looked at me and he said, you know, there are a lot of things I could probably say, but it just sucks. And I talked to my friend Jeff, who just a couple of years before, his own older brother had passed suddenly. And in the moments when I felt like life was dark and gray and gloomy, and I didn't feel like faith was of much use, I had the cloud. And when I was in the cloud, the people who were around me did not tell me that there were brighter days ahead. They told me about the days when they couldn't see either. So our oldest daughter is a junior at the University of Texas. And for years, I was a youth minister here in town. And one summer, when it's crazy busy and I'm taking kids back and forth to camps, going to Abilene a lot, my wife decided that would be a good time to tear her Achilles. And the problem was that we had a young baby, and so Rochelle couldn't move. She didn't have very much mobility. So I had to figure out what I was going to do in taking care of all of these children, getting them back and forth. And so I needed to take our middle school kids to Abilene for Impulse. And so I dropped off our youngest daughter with her grandmother, is about halfway there. And I took Malia and I said, well, I'm going to just take the kids, all the youth group kids, to Abilene, and I will drop them off for camp. Malia will stay with me, we'll get a hotel room, and I'll come back and be here. And so Malia was very excited. She got to ride all the way to Abilene with the teenagers, which is really cool when you are a very young kid. I think she was only 5 or 6 at the time. And what she was really excited about was that she would get to swim at the hotel pool. And so parents, when your kids want to go to Disney World and all these other places, just forget all about that. All they really want to do is swim at the hotel pool. And so we dropped the kids off and we swung over to Walmart to buy her little floaties for her arm in the pool. And like all kids, they say they want to go swimming, but all they really want is for their parents to go swimming and hold them in the water. And so we're in the pool all by ourselves. We've got it. And she's doing great. And so I said, let's see, you've had some swim lessons, how you do? We take off the floaties. I'm kind of holding her for a while, and I want to check to see how far she can swim, how safe she is, all on her own. And so I just kind of let her go. Parents, you've done this, both literally and figuratively. And she's fine. She's doing well. Until she realizes that I have let her go. And then she starts like splashing around and yelling and screaming, and she wraps her arms around my neck, and I grab her and she goes, "Daddy, you saved me." Which I want to be the hero, so I just let her believe. And in all of that, I thought, oh, sweetie, I know that you were scared about what was happening to you. But I had you the whole time. And so, church, however it is you arrive today, know this: your Father in heaven has had you the whole time.